book, but not the people should suffer. It's just wonderful. We were just going not even a few minutes,
all right,
and we were
Carmela,
there.
I'm going to let you go there. The U.S. House is coming in next. Thanks for all your calls this morning. Washington Journal back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. We're going to leave it right here as the U.S. House is about to gavel in for the day. Morning hour speeches up first, and then at noon Eastern they begin legislative work. Plus, we plan to bring you live coverage of the Benghazi hearing during that break. And that's all coming up on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., September 18, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Doug LaMalfa to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to discuss the sixth leading cause of death in the United States of America and the fifth leading cause of death for those aged 65 years and older. It's a disease more than 5 million Americans are living with, and the only cause of death among the top 10 in the United States without a way to cure it or slow its progression. It's a type of dementia that encompasses various diseases and conditions that damage brain cells. Alzheimer's disease. September is Alzheimer's Month, a time spent by Alzheimer's advocates promoting and educating on this life-changing disease. According to the Alzheimer's Association, deaths from Alzheimer's increased close to 70% between 2000 and 2010. During that same time period, deaths from other major diseases, such as heart disease, decreased. In my home state of Pennsylvania in 2010, more than 3,500 individuals died from Alzheimer's. My mom, Mary Thompson, suffered with Alzheimer's for 10 years, as the disease slowly stole her memories, her dignity, and eventually her life. In 2010, Congress passed legislation to create a national plan to combat Alzheimer's disease. It established a national Alzheimer's project within the Department of Health and Human Services to coordinate the country's approach to research and caregiving. This effort supports the amazing work being done through medical research and awareness to improve the lives of those who are living with Alzheimer's. While awareness of Alzheimer's has grown over the last decade, America and the world have a long way to go to educate and combat this disease. Alzheimer's is a condition that most Americans have encountered through a parent, a loved one, a friend, or someone close they care about. However, together, through continued advocacy, research, and the dedicated work of health professionals, care providers, and scientific researchers, we can and will make a difference. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, week after week, I've stood on this floor and talked about hunger in America. Week after week, I've talked about the devastating impacts of hunger in our country, how it affects kids and seniors, and how our country is worse off because of hunger. I've talked about ways we can end hunger, and I've expressed my commitment to the effort to end hunger now. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the Republican leadership not only willfully ignores the plight of the hungry in America, they are actually moving legislation that will make hunger in America worse. Just a few weeks ago, USDA released the newest data on hunger in America. Hunger rates have essentially stayed flat over the past few years. That means that statistically, hunger hasn't gotten worse since the end of the Great Recession, but it hasn't gotten any better either. The United States has a strong anti-hunger safety net. Even though we have 49 million people who don't know where their next meal will come from, we know that nearly 48 million of them are enrolled in SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. SNAP is a lifeline. It provides low-income families with access to food, access they wouldn't otherwise have if they were not enrolled in SNAP. Now let me address a common piece of misinformation, a fabrication that opponents of SNAP continue to use again and again. SNAP is among the most effective and efficient, if not the most effective and efficient, federal program in America. SNAP error rates, overpayments, underpayments, and fraud rates are not only at all-time lows for the program, they are among the lowest rates of any federal program. This notion that fraud, waste, and abuse are rampant in SNAP is a fallacy. It's a make-believe talking point designed to take away food from hungry people. Yet the Republicans are bringing a bill to the floor tomorrow that, if passed, will undoubtedly make hunger worse in this country. Their bill will make hunger worse for working mothers and fathers, for kids, for senior citizens, and even for our veterans. CBO reports that the bill would cut 3.8 million low-income people from SNAP in 2014. And just so there's no misunderstanding, low income means poor. On top of that, an average of nearly 3 million people will be cut from SNAP each and every year over the coming decade. These are some of the nation's most destitute adults, as well as many low-income children, seniors, and families that work for low wages. That's right, people who work but don't make enough to feed their families will be cut from this program. The biggest cut affects at least 1.7 million unemployed, childless adults in 2014 who live in areas of high unemployment. These are poor people. Many don't have the skills or education they need to find a job. This is a group whose average income is about $2,500 a year for a single individual. $2,500 a year. And for most, SNAP is the only government assistance they receive. This bill also cuts an additional 2.1 million people from SNAP in 2014, mostly low-income working families and low-income seniors. These are people who have gross incomes or assets modestly above the federal SNAP limits, but whose disposable income, the income that a family actually has available to spend on food and other needs, is below the poverty line in most cases, often because of high rent or child care costs. And if that weren't bad enough, 210,000 children in those families would also lose their free school meals, and 170,000 unemployed veterans will lose their SNAP benefits. And to top it all off, other poor unemployed parents who want to work but cannot find a job or an opening in a training program, along with their children other than infants, will be cut from the program. Mr. Speaker, I remember when combating hunger was a bipartisan issue, when Bob Dole worked with George McGovern and Bill Emerson worked with Tony Hall. It didn't matter whether you were a liberal or conservative, ending hunger was a priority. The current Republican leadership has blown all that up. We should not do this, Mr. Speaker. There were no hearings on this bill, no markup, no semblance of regular order. And for what? To stick it to the working poor yet again? We should be doing everything we can to end hunger now. The Republican bill just makes hunger worse, and it should be soundly defeated. Mr. Speaker, I urge and I plead with both Democrats and Republicans to stand together, to come together in a bipartisan way and demand an end to end hunger now. Please, please, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, reject this Republican leadership bill that is coming to the floor tomorrow. It is cruel. It is immoral. We are much better than this. Reject the leadership bill. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, although this hall is empty, there are a lot of people watching it, and I wonder how many of them have ever actually gone hungry. How many of the people watching this have had to get a meal so their kids could eat, or to wonder how you get through a summer without subsidized school lunches? It's easy to talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps when you've had designer shoes on your whole life. Tomorrow, we'll be voting on whether or not to cut $40 billion from SNAP. That's a nutrition program for people who do not have access to adequate nutrition. It's a program that helps 1 out of 7 Americans to put food on the table. If this seems familiar, it's because it is familiar. Republicans tried just exactly this before the August recess a couple of months ago. And not surprisingly, for the most unproductive Congress in decades, this bill had to be pulled at the last minute because of lack of support. Even some of the Republicans saw it was too much. Anyone who's been paying attention knows that symbolic votes to nowhere are bread and butter for this Congress. But the Republicans couldn't even get their own support on the bill. $20 billion of cuts that primarily help children and the elderly wasn't enough for them. They had to hurt people more. So here we are again with a new improved plan that doubles the cuts to $40 billion. On top of making 2 million people ineligible for benefits, they are also going to take away our state's ability to provide temporary benefits in times of high unemployment. As a result, the CBO predicts that this will add an additional 1.8 million hungry Americans to the ineligible list. And why are we attempting to inflict another needless round, another needless wound to the working poor? Republicans will tell you the program has grown too much over the last few years, although the need for food stamps were unrelated to a dragging economy. They see no connection between the economy and the fact that people don't have food. Well, that's exactly what the program was designed to do quickly when people are in need. When unemployment is high and people can't pay their bills, that's exactly the time they need the SNAP program. Caseloads rose dramatically when the recession hit. We laid off 700,000 people a month in 2007. But that growth has also slowed as the economy has recovered slowly. The CBO projects that in just a few years, SNAP spending will be back down to 1995 levels as a share of the GDP. And since it's shrinking on its own, it isn't adding to the long-term deficit problems. The rhetoric is simply empty and stupid. Conservatives can try and push this tired welfare abuse narrative. It's a talking point. Every time they come out here, welfare abuse, people are getting food, money for food, that's welfare abuse. But as usual, the reality is not in their corner. Studies show that food assistance has some of the lowest rates of fraud of any benefit program. If you go to one of those food banks and talk to the people who are there, you'll find some surprising people there, people who thought they would never have to go there, but they are short on money and can't feed their kids, so they're getting some money. So I ask you again, why are we doing this? Wasting time to satisfy the furthest right wing of the Republican Party? We're again catering to a fringe agenda thought up by partisans obsessed with a deficit boogeyman. That boogeyman has been roaming around here for 4 years. We're going to have a terrible collapse. We're going to have inflation. We're going to have terrible things. And it's never happened. The President has done a miraculous job in keeping us on an upward track in spite of the resistance of the other side. But what it does is it makes it harder for 4 million people to put food on the table. So be it. That's their attitude. Amen. At least they won't risk facing a primary in the next election. They're all worried about somebody further on the right. We already got one member over here who's, Mr. Speaker, who's worried about somebody coming from the right, and he's about the furthest right I can imagine on the floor. Senate Democrats and Republicans appointed conferees to negotiate a farm bill back at the beginning of August. Quit worrying about scoring points with the Heritage Foundation, and let's focus on the American family and vote this bill down.
Mr. Kowski. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Mrs. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I think each one of us, 435, has to ask ourselves, is this really what we were sent here to do? To take food out of the mouths of hungry people, nearly half of them children? That's what's at stake this week when we are asked to vote on legislation that would cut $39 billion from one of our nation's most successful and important programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. It used to be called food stamps. You know, as a Jew, we just came through the Jewish holidays, and we talked about what it means to be a human being in this world, in this country. Every major religion, every religion in this world and represented in this House teaches you feed the hungry, not as charity, but as a mandate, because that's what it is to be a human being in our world. All the religions have written letters and implored us not to do this. You know, I participated 3 times in the Congressional Food Stamp Challenge, in which we eat on $31.50 for an entire week. And I'm not complaining about it because I knew it was just a week and it would end, but that's the average SNAP benefit. And you know what? You can get the calories. That's pretty easy as you go to the grocery store. If you're lucky enough to live near a grocery store and not in a food desert. But the reality is, for 48 million people, you can get the calories, but it's really hard to get the nutrition. By the time you get to the fruits and vegetables, which are quite expensive, it's hard to do it. So it's not comfortable to rely on SNAP benefits, and many people line up at the end of the month at food pantries that are everywhere in this country, including some of the richest districts. But the SNAP program, which has a bipartisan history, is the last line of defense between 48 million Americans and chronic hunger. You know, the House already voted down a farm bill that included $20 billion in SNAP cuts, and it would have taken benefits away from 1 million children and would have prevented, or at least up to 1 million children, and would have prevented 200,000 hungry children from getting school lunches that they rely on so much. And now this bill is back, but on steroids. In addition to all of the devastating cuts that have been proposed, the House, those that were rejected earlier, the new bill would prevent any able-bodied adult from getting more than 3 months of benefits, SNAP benefits, during a 3-year period, even if they're unable to find work. And many of those people are veterans. Up to 170,000 people who served our country would be denied. This is at a time when unemployment among low-income Americans is over 20%, and the average time of unemployment is about 9 months. Those numbers don't add up. That means that passage of this bill could nearly starve those looking for work, and no one can deny that fact. I know how SNAP benefits my constituents, and I know what would happen if those benefits were lost. I've attended several events at food pantries and community centers, and each time I've heard resounding support for SNAP. In just one day, I received 242 postcards from my constituents urging me to oppose these dangerous cuts to the SNAP program. They have my vote, and I'm imploring my colleagues. It should have the vote of every member of this body to reject those cuts. A constituent who previously wrote to my office summed up her thoughts about the importance of funding the SNAP program this way. Here's what she said. Hungry thoughts every waking day are my constant companion. Here in the supposedly wealthiest country on earth, and it is, please have compassion for your low-income and fixed-income constituents who are loyal, patriotic Americans and who are in dire need of nutritious and affordable food, unquote. A former SNAP beneficiary, a woman named Dresden Schumacher, described the program as a trampoline rather than a safety net. Because of SNAP, she was able to make ends meet for her young family during a period of time of great need. Her story is similar to most SNAP beneficiaries who no longer need food assistance within 1 year of receiving benefits. Were you gaveling? So I'm begging my colleagues, please, don't support these cuts. Let's be the value-driven country that we are and vote no to the $40 billion cut to SNAP.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about the ongoing Republican war on the poor, and that's what this is, and their attempt to gut our nation's critical safety net against hunger one more time. This past June, the Republican leadership failed millions of farmers and millions of struggling families when they could not pass a farm bill. They allowed the extremist Tea Party fringe of their party to poison the farm bill with amendments and so-called reforms that in fact would only increase hardship and hunger in America. Yet instead of working across the aisle to find a better solution that would create jobs and protect families, the Republican leadership has chosen to bring an even more hurtful, toxic, and heartless nutrition bill to the floor. This new bill includes all of the extremist amendments that killed the first farm bill. It also piles on even more restrictions and so-called reforms that only serve to increase hardship for hungry families, children, seniors, and veterans. These false reforms will dramatically reduce access to vital nutrition assistance all across America, rural and urban, in every single one of our congressional districts. This bill would also end critical flexibilities for our states and would cripple smart and targeted programs that allow states to efficiently deliver nutrition assistance to the neediest. For example, the Republican nutrition-only bill would end categorical eligibility for all of our states. We've created this to streamline the delivery of social services so that we can lower administrative costs and put more of these dollars directly into the hands of needy families. This Republican bill would end those efficiencies, raise costs for our states, and make it harder for families to get the help they need. This bill also claims to create work requirements for able-bodied adults. Let me remind my colleagues that the SNAP program already has very restrictive work requirements. The current SNAP program cuts off able-bodied adults after just 3 months of benefits right now. We only allow states to adopt waivers for when unemployment in their states rise high enough that this restriction is clearly unreasonable. The new so-called reforms would cut everybody off, no matter what the unemployment rate is in their state. This is just heartless. These cuts would come at a time when the Republicans have blocked every single effort to pass a real jobs bill in the House and cut job training and job placement assistance. And let me tell you, as a former food stamp recipient myself, I know that people don't want to be on food stamps. They want to work. So if we're going to put work requirements on people, why in the world don't we pass a jobs bill so they can work? At a time when our nation should be creating opportunities for all, the House Republican leadership proposed to cut SNAP by $40 billion. This will surely create a bleaker future for our children, our seniors, and our overall economy. If this bill ever becomes law, and I hope it doesn't, at least 4 to 6 million low-income children, seniors, and families will be cut from this economic lifeline and pushed into poverty. And like about 29 of my colleagues, I have taken the food stamp challenge about 3 times and ate off of $4.50 a day. It was unhealthy and very difficult. Yet I knew it would only last a week for me. Yet millions of Americans see no end in sight. And now, mind you, now they have to worry that this meager benefit, this pittance, that it's going to be cut even more. Instead of gutting SNAP, we need to strengthen it. Not only does SNAP help put food on the table for struggling families, it also helps stimulate economic growth. For every $1 in SNAP benefits, we generate $1.70 in economic activity. So Congressman Conyers and I have introduced new legislation that would extend the SNAP benefits that were increased as a part of the stimulus package. Otherwise, and many don't know this, on November 1st, every single family or individual who receives SNAP benefits now will see an automatic cut of about $29 per month for a family of 3. This will happen regardless of this $40 billion nutrition cut. In 2011, SNAP lifted 4.7 million Americans out of poverty. Without SNAP, millions more would fall into poverty, millions more of Americans would suffer hunger, and our economy would create even fewer jobs and be worse off. I just have to say, our values as Americans and who we are as a country recognize that these despicable cuts are immoral and they're un-American. We need to provide opportunities to help lift families out of poverty, grow the economy, and create economic stability for all. So let's restore a unified farm bill. Let's put an end to these draconian cuts to SNAP. Thank you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veazey, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, there is a cruel war being waged on the poor and hungry in America. I stand today as a voice for more than 1.6 million Texas households who depend on SNAP. Cuts to SNAP, our nation's first line of defense against hunger, are immoral. I will not stand by as my Republican colleagues continue to balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable Americans. House Republicans unveiled on Monday a plan to cut over $40 billion in SNAP over the next 10 years. This proposed package would eliminate basic food assistance for over 4 million Americans, including poor, jobless adults in areas of high unemployment, working poor families, children, seniors, and even struggling veterans. Some might say that the proposal is an attempt to reduce fraud or waste in the program. Some say benefits are going to adults who don't want to work. But I have news for people who say that. You try earning minimum wage, working hard every day, and you will still, after working 40 hours a week at the end of the year, only make around $15,000. All of these claims are misleading to the public. SNAP fraud has been reduced to about 1 cent per dollar spent on the program, according to the most recent USDA statistics. In fact, the cuts will come from benefits that many Americans need to survive. These cuts will take food out of our seniors' refrigerators and food from the mouths of our babies. This new legislation unfairly targets millions of unemployed adults who want to find work, but due to a bad economy and a sluggish recovery, they cannot find a job. This includes Republicans, too. I worked at a grocery store in Texas when I was in high school, and I saw Republicans come in from Republican strongholds like Weatherford, Texas, Azle, Lake Worth. They were on SNAP. People need to stop stereotyping the program. Proponents claim that these cuts represent work requirements. But that is willfully misleading, Mr. Speaker. The provisions would callously terminate food aid to people who are willing to work but just can't find a job. Just a few short weeks ago, the Republican leadership of this House tried to eliminate the SNAP benefits entirely when they stripped the nutrition program from the Farm Bill. This is a cruel assault against the most vulnerable and neediest Americans. Those affected by the bill's harshest provisions include even low-income veterans, putting their food at risk for an assistant 170,000 of the approximately 900,000 veterans who receive SNAP. Mr. Speaker, I also participated in the SNAP challenge this year and lived on a budget of $4.50 a day, and can attest it was not easy. I had to make tough decisions and realized firsthand how difficult it is to follow a healthy diet on such a limited budget. I made difficult choices, as families do every day, between purchasing nutritious options and what's on sale. As a father of a 7-year-old son, I cannot imagine the decisions many Texans have to make every day, including skipping a meal to provide nutrition for their kids. When drafting this legislation, did anyone take the time to think about how these SNAP cuts would hurt our kids? Nearly half of all SNAP participants are kids. This represents close to 1 in 3 children in the United States. Without access to nutritious meals, our children are put at risk of developmental delays, poorer physical health, and many other ailments. Mr. Speaker, we need to do everything that we can to keep the SNAP program going. The conditions that I talked about are very serious. When you think about affecting a child's ability to learn and perform well in school, these long-range implications have a dire consequence for our entire economy. I asked my friends on the other side of the aisle that support these cuts, what did these kids that I just talked about, what did these kids do to deserve these cuts? This past year, some 49 million Americans lacked access to adequate food because they didn't have enough money or other resources to meet their basic food needs. Many of these hungry Americans skipped meals or took other steps to reduce what they ate to make ends meet. I represent a constituent in my district who is both elderly and disabled and live on a fixed income. She receives about $93 a month in SNAP benefits, but recently those were cut to about $52 a month. That's only $1.73 a day. And if this bill passed, she will be cut off the program entirely. I asked proponents of this program, where is she to find assistance for her nutrition needs? I refuse to stand silent as some propose we take food out of the mouths of the hungry. SNAP is also a very powerful anti-poverty program that has helped make our economy stronger. In 2011, SNAP kept 4.7 million people out of poverty.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, for 5 minutes. Without objection. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for Congress to work together on a common-sense solution to address the impacts of climate change. As we begin Hispanic Heritage Month, it's important for us to recognize the impact climate change is disproportionately having upon minority communities across the country. Whether it's farmers and ranchers in my home state of New Mexico struggling through devastating drought conditions, or communities that are being impacted by recent flooding as a result of more severe weather, millions of Americans have been impacted by the effects of climate change. Released earlier this year, a survey conducted by Public Policy Polling found 74% of Latinos believe climate change is a serious or a very serious problem, a higher level than the 65% among all American adults. 68% of Latinos support the President using his authority to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, including 60% of all American adults. 69% of Latinos agree with the President's statement that for the sake of our children and our future, we must do more to combat climate change, compared to 62% of all American adults. Combating climate change and preserving our land, water, and air is a top priority for many Americans, especially those in minority communities. For years, a coalition of stakeholders, including Hispanic farmers and ranchers, tribal communities, conservation groups, hunting and fishing organizations, and local governments came together to lay the foundation that led to President Obama establishing the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument earlier this year. This is an example of the type of leadership and advocacy that can make a real difference in addressing climate change and preserving our precious resources. By establishing the Rio Grande del Norte, we have created economic certainty for farmers and ranchers, increased recreation and tourism opportunities, and most importantly, protected our land, water, and air for future generations. Mr. Speaker, I've also come to the floor today to express my concern for the House Republicans' plan to slash funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This program is vital to many in New Mexico, especially our children. Sadly, New Mexico ranks near the bottom when it comes to childhood well-being and ranked worst in childhood hunger. The Republican plan to cut $40 billion from the SNAP program caters to the most extreme views. Earlier this year, they tried to cut $20 billion, only to have the Tea Party revolt. So the new plan goes even further at a time when many communities are still struggling from a slow economy, even including a provision that prevents high unemployment areas from receiving additional assistance. Today we have 47 million Americans living in poverty, and while we should be doing more to address the root causes, we should not turn our backs on those struggling to make ends meet by cutting benefits that help put food on the table for working families. I believe we all share the goal of seeing a stronger economy that creates jobs and reduces the need for this kind of assistance. But until that time, let's not make the most vulnerable among us pay the steepest price. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Enyart, for 5 minutes.
I seek leave to revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, during the 35 years I spent in the military, it was my privilege to lead outstanding men and women in our armed forces. Many are still serving today. They served with honor and distinction, yet here we are talking about treating the lowest paid of them like second-class citizens, unworthy of basic assistance in these difficult times. I was elected to Congress to represent everyone in the 12th Congressional District of Illinois. I represent the poorest county in the state of Illinois. 100,000 people in my district, most of them children or seniors, live below the poverty line. My district has a higher proportion of veterans than any other district in this state. I answer to active duty military and veterans who rely on SNAP benefits to make ends meet. They exist in my district and in every district represented in this House. Mr. Speaker, does anyone in this chamber wish to tell them that in this hour of need, their country is turning their back on them? Who among us wants to decide which of these service members, which of these veterans deserves assistance and which do not? I know I don't. According to the Census Bureau, about 7% of people who report prior military service also report receiving SNAP benefits. Census data indicates that some 1.5 million households with a veteran are receiving SNAP benefits. The base pay of most recent enlistees, from corporals on down, are at or below the $23,000 poverty rate for a family of 4. At military commissaries nationwide, nearly $88 million in SNAP benefits were redeemed. Stars and Stripes reported that in 2011, food stamp purchases at military commissaries tripled during the preceding 4 years. Just last month, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities reported that approximately 900,000 veterans currently receive food aid, and proposed cuts would impact around 170,000. According to the Hill newspaper, more than $98 million in SNAP benefits was redeemed by veterans in 2012. The Huffington Post reports that in 2011, both active duty members and military retirees used more than $100 million in federal food aid last year. 16% of SNAP benefits are disabled, many of them veterans. SNAP benefits are already scheduled to go down. On November 1st, families of 3 will lose $29 a month. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but the daily per person per meal benefit will be less than $1.40. Recently, one Illinois veteran was quoted saying, "I relocated, and the job I was supposed to get fell through. I lived off my savings, but found myself needing to apply for emergency assistance to sustain until I found a job. I, like many others, was only receiving assistance for a short period of time," just 5 minutes for that veteran, "but I don't know what I would have done without it." They served us with honor and distinction, Mr. Speaker. Some are still serving. Now it is time for us to serve them with a measure of honor and distinction of our own. I urge my colleagues to reject these shameful proposals, which would cut this basic level of assistance to deserving recipients who need it now more than ever. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you,
Without
Mr. Speaker.
objection.
Mr. Speaker, I probably don't need 5 minutes to say what I would like to say. This is a very sad moment for the most powerful nation in the history of this planet. We are on the verge of a government shutdown over ideology. I can remember 1995, I was the mayor of Kansas City when the government shut down, and the impact was Herculean, not just here in Washington, but around the country and around the world. And if we are proud to be Americans, it means we pay our bills. We are the only nation that still allows a vote by a legislature on paying our bills. Most countries won't do that because they don't need any disruption in paying their debts. We're close to declaring to the whole world that we don't pay our bills. The other part that's troublesome is this whole issue of SNAP, or food stamps. And there are so many myths that roll around that it just turns my stomach. I didn't live in a house with running water or electricity until I was 7 years old. We moved in public housing. My father worked 3 jobs. He eventually was able to buy a home. I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to struggle. My father was able to send my mother to school when I was in the 8th grade, to college, and then all 4 of his children graduated from college, 2 with postgraduate degrees. And so I am always insulted when I hear all of these irreverent and nasty comments about poor people. And we spread this stuff around the country to the point of absurdity. We spread lies. Well, people go into stores and they buy alcohol with food stamps. Well, we don't have food stamps anymore. We have cards, economic benefit transfer cards. And in spite of the lies that people tell, you can't buy alcohol with cards. You cannot buy lottery tickets. I've heard members of Congress, this Congress, tell people that they know that people in prison are getting food stamps. And they've seen people buy alcohol with food stamp cards. It doesn't work. And it divides and damages this nation. The other lie, over 70% of the people receiving SNAP benefits are the elderly, the disabled, and children. And we are against helping them. Another 25% are people who work every day. Just they can't make enough to survive. I remember growing up and my mother would say, you know, eat everything in your plate. There are starving kids in Africa. Well, I'm not sure how eating everything in my plate helped them. I'm still struggling with that. But there's starving people not far from here. And the government of the United States is saying, we'd rather shut down. We'd rather shut down than to have a program that deals with the people who are in trouble. I just heard a few moments ago about a 101-year-old person whose daily meals, Meal on Wheels, have been reduced. 101 years old. And people are celebrating that. Mr. Speaker, this is a sad, sad day. And by the end of next week, when we shut down, it's going to be much sadder. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this week marks the meltdown of Lehman Brothers, the 5-year anniversary of the greatest financial crisis in a generation that struck our country. This economic disaster nearly caused the destruction of our country's entire financial infrastructure and led to what we now call the Great Recession. However, Wall Street during the last 5 years has actually profited greatly from this crisis and in the process have caused continuing financial failures of millions of Americans. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley have all reported record profits during the recession. Wall Street in the last 5 years has regained all of its pre-crisis wealth with interest. Wouldn't the American people like to be in that position? Meanwhile, Main Street has yet to see a real robust recovery. The roots of the recession began in the late 1990s when a majority in this Congress first overturned something called the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated speculative banking from prudent banking, and then in 2000 refused to regulate the trading of derivatives by hamstringing the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Wall Street turned once stable investments into the toxic assets that brought down our economy. American taxpayers were then asked to bail out these same banks responsible for trashing our economy and facilitating the single greatest redistribution of wealth from the poor and middle class to the rich in American history. Our middle class has shrunk. And guess what? The ranks of the poor shot up. It's no wonder people can't afford to pay for food. American citizens continue to struggle to recuperate their lost wealth from a clever banking system that stole their equity. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas recently reported that the cost of the collapse to the United States economy was up to $14 trillion. Is it any wonder we have rising debt levels? It could be more when you factor in potential permanent losses in earning power by Americans who aren't paying taxes anymore because they're not working yet. According to the Economic Policy Institute, from 2000 to 2011, the median income for working-age households fell from approximately $64,000 a year to $55,000. This is a decline of nearly 13%. The U.S. Census Bureau paints a similar bleak picture of the precipitous decline in American household income. It shows that the overall median income of households has continued to fall since the start of the recession, and now people are earning, guess what, similar to what their median income was in 1988. They've lost decades of growth. Income inequality has only widened during the crisis, where only the top 5% of income earners in our country saw an increase in their earnings between 2010 and 2011. The top is doing fine, everybody else is not. In addition, a GAO report earlier this year estimated that the total loss in household equity from the crisis to be $9 trillion. Those are some of your neighbors and mine. What a property taking that is. Losses on this level prevent Americans from owning their own homes, opening their own businesses, or going to college and ultimately creating their own American dream. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, we see the enormous accumulation of banking assets and vast financial power in a handful of institutions. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, all of them are making enormous profits, indeed the highest profits in the nation, along with the oil companies. 15 years ago, the assets of the 6 largest banks were approximately 17% of gross domestic product. Today, estimates for the assets of those same banks are equivalent to over half of our gross domestic product. So 6 institutions, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley control an enormous percentage of our banking system and, in turn, your future and our nation's future. That is too much power in the hands of the Big Six. America is currently in the midst of the slowest recovery from a recession since World War II, and it's important that this Congress not sit idly by. In the 5 years since the recession, we have only managed to put more money in the pockets of the top 1%, ignoring the difficulties of the bottom 99%. One way to begin rectifying this situation is to reinstitute the Glass-Steagall Act, co-sponsor H.R. 129, the Return to Prudent Banking Act, and the executive branch should prosecute the predatory practices of those institutions that have led to this harm to the American people. There should be no statute of limitation on the justice that is owed to the American people. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my strong opposition to the deep cuts to nutrition programs that are being proposed this week by my friends on the other side of the aisle. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program provides critical food and nutrition support for hardworking families in cities and towns all across my home state in Rhode Island. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that more than 180,000 Rhode Islanders rely on this important program every day. Once again, House Republicans have decided that rather than working to come to a bipartisan agreement on the Farm Bill, that they will instead pander to the far right of their party, and in doing so impose real hardships on America's working families and put many children at risk of going hungry all across our country. While protecting generous subsidies for agricultural corporations, my Republican colleagues are threatening the food security of our most vulnerable neighbors. So let's review this package of cuts to the nutrition program and consider its impact on children, seniors, veterans, and families. First, the Congressional Budget Office estimates this proposal would cut SNAP funding by at least $40 billion. Some of these cuts would be particularly devastating for seniors and low-income families. For example, this bill would eliminate categorical eligibility, putting working families at greater risk of going hungry and eliminating the incentive to find work. Currently, a working mother who makes a little more than $24,000 a year qualifies for SNAP if her disposable income falls under 130% of the poverty line due to the rising costs of child care or rent. This bill would eliminate this provision and deny some working mothers and children in 40 states from receiving necessary nutrition assistance. Make no mistake, this places a cruel burden on working families who can least afford it. But it gets worse. Another provision would require the mother of any child a year of age to work or participate in a training program or risk losing their nutrition assistance. At a time of high unemployment and dwindling resources for job training, this bill means that a 2-year-old could go hungry if the child's mother can't participate in job training or find work. And of course, these provisions don't only impact working families. Even a veteran receiving disability compensation could lose their exemption and have their nutrition assistance terminated if they can't find a job under this bill. These cuts imposed on the backs of disabled veterans, children younger than 6, and working moms are bad enough. But to compound these cuts, the Republican Farm Bill makes it more likely additional beneficiaries will be hurt as well. This legislation would actually encourage individual states to kick people off nutrition assistance by promising them 50% of the savings. Of course, some of this is old news. We're here debating this issue again. Shockingly, the immoral, outrageous cuts I've already outlined weren't enough for the conservative fringe. They weren't satisfied with cutting funding for SNAP. They demanded even deeper cuts that would force more children and more unemployed workers to go hungry. They've insisted that more seniors and veterans, the people who helped build this country, should be turned away at their local market. The House Republican leadership was happy to comply, and they decided to make a bad bill worse. They doubled the cuts imposed on the SNAP program and chose to slash nutrition assistance by a total of $40 billion. These newer cuts target jobless adults without children who live in areas with high rates of unemployment. The National Association of Evangelicals said they were, quote, especially concerned about this proposal. Let's not mischaracterize this as a new work requirement. The changes proposed in this bill tell people who are struggling to find work in a difficult economy that if their job search goes on longer than 3 months, they should go hungry too. But the bill does not provide additional workforce training resources, and it doesn't invest in job creation to help individuals find work. This sends a clear message. If you're struggling to find a job in an area hard hit by the recession, get ready, because in a few months, you're also going to struggle to eat. And let's not forget the context in which this particular bill was drafted. It comes after House Republicans stripped out the nutrition title and passed the rest of the Farm Bill. In other words, they were happy to provide agricultural companies with extremely generous subsidies to purchase crop insurance. They were happy to spend $40 billion on commodity programs, but nutrition assistance for children and the unemployed was apparently a bridge too far. Dozens of religious groups and other leaders have strongly opposed this bill. Earlier this week, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops reminded us that, quote, how the House chooses to address our nation's hunger and nutrition programs will have a profound human and moral consequence. The Jewish Federation argued that this bill, quote, would constitute untenable trauma to millions of Americans and their families. Former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, a Republican, warned this is no time to play politics with hunger. They've sent a clear message. This bill is wrong, it's immoral, and does not reflect our values as a country. I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this proposal. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
So members are taking a break now before resuming legislative work at noon Eastern, as you heard. There is one bill on the agenda which seeks to streamline the permitting process for certain mining operations on federal lands. House Republican leaders met this morning, and House Speaker John Boehner announced that after the meeting that added to the House calendar this week is debate and votes on funding to keep the government operating past the current temporary funding date of September 30th. It will also include language defunding the nation's health care law. The Associated Press adds House Majority Leader Eric Cantor says the House will also push to delay the health care law for a year as part of a plan to extend the government's ability to borrow. He said debt ceiling talks will also include a path forward on tax reform and approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. We expect to hear more on this when the House gavels back in this afternoon. Live coverage here on C-SPAN. Again, the House gaveling in at noon Eastern. While the House break is underway, we'll go live now to a congressional hearing on the investigation into the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. A quick note, we welcome